Now we're going to have a quick revision session on the concept of equilibria. So firstly, we need to remind ourselves of what is conveyed in demand and supply curves. So going back to the microeconomic lectures in the course, remember a demand curve is typically downward sloping like this, and it represents changes in demand for a particular item. In this case we're looking at almonds, as the price changes. So the slope tells us about the responsiveness of consumers to this change in price. So here the price increases from here to here, we see a fall in quantity demanded from here to here. Everything else is held constant when we look at this relationship between quantity demanded and price. So we're holding constant things like the change in the size of the population, change in consumer income, change in the taste of the population. Another thing which is embodied in a demand curve is the elasticity of demand. So here we see that a change in the price has an almost proportional change in quantity demanded. But if we think about a good such as oil, we know that the demand is relatively inelastic. So we get a different slope on our demand curve. So here, if we take the same change in price, we'll see that there is a much smaller change in the quantity demanded. And this reflects our knowledge that, at least in the short term, there are very few alternatives to oil. It's going to require a great deal of investigation and innovation for consumers to replace oil in their consumption basket. Now let's turn to supply. So if you remember, the supply represents what's available at different prices. So it's reflecting on the responsiveness of producers. So here we see that this increase in price leads to this change in the supply of almonds. Now remember, we talked about the responsiveness of particular industries and particular products, and we tried to think about the influence of time. So even if the demand for almonds is sufficient to increase the price, in the short term we can only increase the supply by a limited amount. This is to do with the fact it's an agricultural product, so it's going to take some time to generate a greater supply. If we had a manufactured product, it might be easier to get our inputs and increase supply. We might be able to do things in the short term like reduce the amount of waste, run additional shifts, and in the long term we'd expect our supply curve to have a much flatter slope, representing the number of trade-offs that can be made over time. Again, elasticity is embedded in the slope of the supply curve. If we think about oil, then once again we're thinking about a good that has a relatively inelastic supply. So if we think about changes in demand for oil, we know that in order to bring forth additional resources, we're going to have to make big investments in infrastructure, and we're going to have to extract supplies from remote areas of the globe. So it's very expensive, time consuming and expensive. Now we put these two curves together to find an equilibrium. So in the final diagram we're looking at a microeconomic equilibrium. Equilibrium is a stable point where what's available from producers, what is supplied, meets with what is demanded by consumers. So the fact that these two curves meet gives us our equilibrium, P star and Q star. So once again we're holding a number of things constant. If anything changes in terms of the population size, the population's tastes, or the population's incomes, we'd expect to see a change in the demand curve. So let's imagine there's been some migration, then we'll see an increase in demand, and we'll be at this particular point here. Let's imagine that this particular good has now been subject to some technical innovation. So now we'll see an increase in the supply of this particular good. And again we see a new equilibrium So any change which is not captured in the original demand curve or the original supply curve requires us to draw a new curve. So something fundamental has changed, we can no longer hold everything constant, and we have a new, distinct equilibrium position. We took a similar approach to our macroeconomic analysis. So we can reproduce an aggregate demand curve in a similar way to the demand curve in the microeconomic environment. We're looking at demand for all products across all consumers within any one given economy, so any particular country. But we need to think in this case, what do the labels represent? So in the micro context, our vertical was price, our horizontal was quantity. In the macro context, we can think about the vertical axis as representing price, but also representing inflation, which we recognise as being one of the key macroeconomic indicators. The horizontal axis, which up here represented the quantity of a given good, now represents the total demand of all goods and services in the economy. But it's also giving us an indication of national income. So what's the GDP like in this particular economy? And it gives us an inkling into full employment. Are we at a high sustainable level of employment? So when we think about aggregate demand, the demand for all goods and services, we're thinking about demand for goods coming from consumers, from firms, from the government, and from trade, exports minus imports. So this is our aggregate demand curve. Next, let's think about aggregate supply. So aggregate supply represents the macroeconomic equivalent of our supply curve up here. So originally we might think of aggregate supply as looking like this. So this is aggregate supply, a low level of price, we see a low level of output, but at higher prices more is brought forward and supplied to the market by firms. However, because we have different axes when we think about supply across the whole economy, we're changing our labels. So this represents prices and inflation. Horizontal axis represents total supply, total quantity. It also represents national income and the level of employment. So here we want to think about aggregate supply as representing an economy with some spare capacity. So I've been encouraging you to think about aggregate supply as being horizontal, then sloped, and then completely vertical, representing the fact that at a low level of employment and national income, we've got spare capacity. As capacity begins to tighten, we'll see some rise in prices with the increase in output. And then finally, when we've used all of our spare capacity, stimulation of the economy just leads to inflation. So now I need to put these two together. So we've got aggregate demand 1, and we're going to combine this with our complicated or more realistic aggregate supply curve. So here, let's call this position 1. We have an equilibrium position. Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. But we can identify that at this particular equilibrium we have a relatively low level of employment and a relatively low level of national income. So we are in equilibrium, but it's not an ideal equilibrium because there's this whole raft of spare resources. Spare resources in terms of capital that's available, in terms of workers who are available to work, and in terms of other inputs that we could turn into goods and services. Our second potential equilibrium is reached here. So let's imagine that we've engaged in some aggregate demand stimulation. So we've used demand side policies, whether it's working through consumer households, firm investment, direct government spending on public and merit goods, or through stimulating trade, we have increased the level of demand in this economy. So we are now at a level of high national income, GDP, of high output, and of high employment. So we no longer, because this is now vertical, we no longer have any spare capacity in this economy. The downside of this stimulation is that because we had no spare capacity, our stimulus has resulted in inflation. This move up the vertical section of aggregate supply just reminds us there were no further resources to be used, so by increasing prices, all we've done is cause inflation. Prices have risen to try and ration consumer demand because demand-side policies weren't enough to generate new inputs. If we want to have this stimulus in employment and national output and national income without inflation, then we have to do something to our aggregate supply curve. We have to increase the quantity or the quality of resources that are available, in which case our aggregate demand stimulus would have led to greater employment, greater income, greater output for this economy, but with a lower level of inflation. So this is equilibrium. A number of equilibrium positions are available in the macroeconomy, but it depends upon our macroeconomic priorities. Are we concerned to maximise employment, or are we concerned to make sure inflation is as low as possible? And different ideological or political positions of government ensure that they prioritise different macroeconomic objectives.